Now we're going to consider our first example of a regulatory control system in an actual body. And again, the theme is homeostasis. How does the body maintain a constant internal state? In this case, our focus is on temperature. So our question is, how do you maintain your body temperature? So there are a couple of threats to homeostasis here. One is cold, the other one is heat. If you move into a cold environment, this control system that I'm going to describe has to somehow figure out a way of keeping the cold from penetrating into those very fragile cells and molecules in the interior of your body. And I've laid out all the parts of a control system earlier. We know that there's sensory components, and then there's an efferent pathway and action against a threat to homeostasis, in this case, cold. So on the sensory side, we of course become aware of that cold in part through the feeling of cold on your skin. And that's detected by thermoreceptors. You can think of thermoreceptors as modified neurons with dendrites having temperature-sensitive responses. And so here we see one of those neurons. Just imagine there's lots of these woven into your skin. And this axon terminates in a very particular place in your nervous system, your spinal cord. Okay, so each of the neurons in your skin that senses temperature has those dendrites woven into the skin. And then if you follow that single cell all the way into the spine, you'll see that the axon terminal is in the middle of the spinal cord. This is a cross-section of a spinal cord. And the cross-section has this butterfly shape to it. And there's a color difference. The interior is darker than the superficial area. And the superficial area is known as white matter as a consequence. And the interior is called gray matter. And that color difference has to do with myelination. So we talked about how myelination of an axon facilitates a rapid propagation of an action potential. It turns out there are unmyelinated axons as well. And in the spinal cord, the difference in color has to do with myelination. So axons that are myelinated reside in the white matter, and the gray matter has unmyelinated axons. Now, another feature of the myelination and the spinal cord is that those myelinated axons are run up and down the spinal cord. So this cross-section would also be a cross-section through those axons. Whereas the gray matter largely consists of interneurons or the endings and beginnings of other neurons that are unmyelinated. So they have largely lateral traffic, whereas the myelinated axons go into and out of the plane here. So when you feel that cold and at the surface of your skin, that's transduced by the thermoreceptor, and then the signal is transmitted through the axon of the thermoreceptor. There's then a chemical synapse to a neuron that is myelinated and therefore runs through the white matter all the way up to the brain. And because that transmission is approaching the brain, we refer to it as an ascending tract. And that has a particular anatomical position in the cross-section of the spinal cord. Now we're going to talk about regions of the brain. So up above we have my crude rendering of the brain. And at the end of the brain stem, we have a region known as the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is sort of this relay station. It also can function as an integrating center, but it tends to direct traffic to other regions of the brain for sensory and motor signals. In this case, the region of the brain that is then activated after the thalamus is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is the integrating center for thermoregulation. Here's a CT scan of a skull, and we have the hypothalamus highlighted in red there. It's a little heart-shaped piece of the brain. And now that we're talking about the brain and the spinal cord, we should differentiate the major parts of your nervous system. The brain and spinal cord compose the central nervous system, the CNS, whereas the thermoreceptors are outside of the CNS and therefore considered part of the peripheral nervous system. So all nerves outside of the CNS are part of the peripheral nervous system. Another term here is interneuron. Okay, an interneuron is a neuron that connects to two neurons. So the dendrites might be receiving signals from one neuron, and then the axon will have a chemical synapse to other neurons on the other end. So that's what an interneuron is. Okay, so what I've mapped out here is the afferent pathway for a control system, and we've highlighted the integration center. So let's map that on a flow chart. On the left, we have our state variable, temperature, just like the thermostat example. That's detected by the cutaneous thermoreceptors. That's analogous to the temperature sensor within a thermostat. And then we have an integration center in the hypothalamus, which receives that signal from the cutaneous thermoreceptors, and it compares that reported temperature against the set point, your body temperature. And the difference, as we've talked about before, is known as the error. That error is reported to the hypothalamic regulatory center, and then the hypothalamus, or that region of the hypothalamus, then decides whether or not to take action. Is it cold enough to do something about it? So now we transition to a consideration of the efferent pathway. That action is going to depend not just on the input of the error, but also an algorithm. And this algorithm is the same that we applied to the thermostat. That is, if the error is below some threshold, initiate an action. In this case, that action is shivering. And shivering is occurring in the periphery. This is also sensed in the periphery, so we're going to refer to it as our peripheral algorithm. And shivering is achieved by your skeletal muscles. And so we're activating a motor neuron. The skeletal muscles contract in an oscillatory fashion, which creates the shivering. All right, that comprises our efferent pathway. So let's take a look on the right-hand side at the anatomy that's responsible for that efferent pathway. The hypothalamus is dictating the commands, and those commands are sent along what we call a descending tract. So this is sort of like the opposite of that ascending tract that we considered. It travels through white matter because it might have to travel quite a distance, and therefore along a myelinated axon. And that neuron will then terminate at the cell body of a motor neuron that in turn innervates the skeletal muscle that's going to contract to generate heat for shivering. Those motor neurons emerge from a portion of the spinal cord called the ventral root. Okay, so the hypothalamus says, I'm cold, let's do some shivering. Then that signal goes all the way through the spinal cord, terminates, and this can happen in lots and lots of places in parallel. It would be a little odd for just one muscle to do the shivering. So just imagine that this is repeated many times in order to activate skeletal muscles for shivering. That's going to tend to generate heat. So our problem is that we have a low temperature. If we generate the heat from shivering, that's going to tend to counter that low temperature, which gives us the negative feedback because now that's going to help to reduce the error, which might eventually cause the shivering to turn off. Okay, so we've described something that happens largely in the periphery. We're sensing the temperature in the skin. We're recruiting skeletal muscles through motor neurons in the periphery as well. But we also have a separate pathway for responding to cold temperatures, and that is in the hypothalamus itself. The hypothalamus is temperature sensitive. And again, we have a comparison between the temperature that is detected by the hypothalamus, which is essentially monitoring the blood flow, the temperature of blood flow to the brain. That is compared against our set point, which again is body temperature. And here we have a mirror image of the error that we were concerned with in the periphery. And this has its own algorithm, but it's the same algorithm that we saw before on the afferent side. That is, if our error is below the lower threshold, let's do something about it. Now, in this case, the action is different. Instead of shivering, we have a reduction in blood flow. And it's a particular region of the body where we're going to reduce blood flow. And that region is in the skin, okay? If the skin is being exposed to a low temperature, it's better to keep the blood in the interior of the body than to be exchanging thermally with the environment. So the way that that looks in our flowchart is we're going to add another efferent pathway. In this case, we don't have motor neurons, but something called sympathetic neurons. We'll detail what that means later. But those neurons are responsible for controlling blood flow. And so the blood vessels in the skin, these cutaneous blood vessels, undergo vasoconstriction. They're reducing in their diameter. And that causes blood to flow not to the skin, but to other regions of the body. So this is a central algorithm. We have the hypothalamus itself detecting that change in temperature. Now, the efferent part is in the periphery. So if we look on the right-hand side, we have a similar pattern with a descending tract. This time, the motor, instead of activating a motor neuron, we're activating this pathway that includes something called an autonomic ganglion. We'll get into that later. But the target here is not a skeletal muscle, but instead a smooth muscle. And that smooth muscle functions to shunt blood away from the skin. So we've got two pathways to deal with low temperatures. There's the central one, and then there's the peripheral algorithm. And we've got two separate afferent pathways, two separate efferent pathways as well. So for responses to low temperature, we have those two parallel and efferent pathways. On the afferent side, there's both peripheral and central sensing. And on the efferent side, there's both a somatic pathway, that's the skeletal muscles, and an autonomic pathway, the cutaneous blood vessels. Of course, high temperatures are a problem as well. So if you're in a warm environment, some of the same pathways play a role. Actually, most of the same pathways play a role. So what I've done is subtract all of the efferent pathways that have nothing to do with a response to heat. And then we can fill in the other parts that we need to add. So for example, on the peripheral side of things, we now have a peripheral algorithm, which says that if the error is above the high threshold, then we're going to do a response. In this case, that response is sweating. Okay, there's no like reverse of sweating that occurs in response to cold. So we're going to add an efferent pathway that includes sweat glands. Those are achieved by sympathetic neurons. Okay, we have that same term again. We'll detail what that means later on. But just know that this sympathetic pathway is an example of a particular kind of autonomic pathway. So you're not conscious of it. And in response, you start sweating. That allows for evaporative cooling, which will tend to reduce temperature and therefore counteract the stimulus that was detected by the cutaneous thermoreceptors. At the same time, if the blood that bathes your hypothalamus starts to increase, then a central algorithm is recruited. Again, if our current temperature, our state variable, minus the set point, that is the error, exceeds threshold, then the response here is to increase blood flow. And in particular, it's to increase the blood flow to the skin. Okay, if we want to take advantage of the evaporative cooling provided by sweating, then it's best to have a lot of blood flow to the skin. And so that's achieved by vasodilation of the blood vessels in the skin, increasing blood flow and allowing for a cooling of that blood, which then returns to the interior of the body. So in response to high temperature, we again have two parallel pathways, both afferent and efferent pathways. The central afferent response is the opposite of the low temperature response. Okay, we had the same components on the central side for both high and low temperature, whereas the peripheral response is different. We had shivering in the case of low temperature. Here we have, in response to high temperature, sweating. Okay, so those are the major components of thermoregulation. There's one last point I want to make, which is this notion of a set point isn't etched in stone. That is, it doesn't just stay fixed under all circumstances. And in fact, your body temperature very slightly changes over the course of a day. So what we see here is temperature over the course of a day. You can see on the y-axis, the range is only a half degree C. So it's a pretty small variation. But if you made a recording of your body temperature with high temporal resolution, you would see all kinds of oscillations, but a general trend that over the course of the night, there's a drop in your body temperature. And as you become more active during the day, there's a temperature rise. Okay, and this is the high frequency oscillations have to do with the kinds of oscillations that are permitted by the thermoregulatory control system, much like we saw those oscillations generated by a thermostat. But they're oscillating around a trend line, which represents the set point P. So again, we've got a state variable S and a set point P. Here, this graph illustrates how P changes over time, and therefore the nature of the control system will vary over time as reflected by these measurements of body temperature.